All right, so thank you all for being here in our virtual summer camp. We are about to get started with our first talk of the day in track 2, which is on immersion, flow, and usability in video games by Raphael Leroy, or please correct me if I said that incorrectly here.
No, it's perfect.
All right, just so y'all know, so this talk looks like it is see the schedule is 25 minutes long. And would you like questions? I mean, people can ask questions throughout in chat. And would you like we have a moderator here, Jeremiah, that can either kind of interrupt you if he notices there's questions to be asked, or we can wait to the end and have questions then. Which would you prefer?
I think it would be easier if I just go through everything, and then if people have questions, even throughout the presentation, they can send them in the Q&A, and I can go through them after also, since I'm not sure if that wouldn't be too long then with the questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's totally fine. I'm seeing from the chat that some people are having some issues going in. If anybody can see that, please note that for this track only, there is a password. The webinar link should automatically put the password if you click on it. But if you're having trouble, there is also a password of GUR SC 2020. So if anybody knows somebody that's having trouble getting in, hopefully they can pass them along that link and tell them the password. In that case, whenever you are ready to get started, feel free to use your video if you like or not, however you want to go through this, and whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so hello everyone. Good morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. So my name is Raphael Leroy, and today I'm going to talk about immersion, flow, and usability in games. It is based on the research I've made for my master thesis in psychology, which I'm still currently working on. So just to quickly introduce myself before starting, so I am from Belgium. I'm currently working as a user researcher in a company that works on improving the user experience on websites and apps. I did an internship there and then continuing at a student job. I have a bachelor degree in psychology, and I'm doing my master degree in work and ergonomic psychology. And my master thesis is about user experience in video games, and more precisely on how usability can influence flow and immersion. And finally, I would be doing my second internship in September at Massive in Sweden, hopefully if the current situation improves. So the purpose of this presentation is to show what the research says about these different concepts, how it defines them, and how they relate to each other. To also show what can be used in game user research and what cannot. And finally, things to be aware of when doing research and user testing. So the different subjects today are engagement and immersion, flow and presence, motivation, and finally, usability. So first, engagement. So engagement is mostly used to describe the engaging experience with the game. So it comes from the interaction between the player and the game. It is the wish to spend time playing the game in a way. So it therefore requires time and attention above all. For example, you can play a game and not be very engaged if you don't really care about it, or if you end up talking to someone else at the same time. At this level, there's already the feeling of being involved in the game. So time passes kind of more quickly. You forget about your surroundings, for example. It feels more automatic when you play. And engagement is also related to the other concept I'm gonna talk about in this presentation. So some authors say that there is no emotional involvement yet at this point, and that it is just energy, attention, and time being invested. Others mentioned that emotions can already emerge from the interaction with the game. So as you can see on the slide, there is a questionnaire that some researchers created. And you can see, for example, that they already talk about feeling scared, or it makes me feel calm, this kind of thing. So they already integrate this emotional part a little bit there. So for some authors, engagement is the first step that comes before immersion with the game, but it is also sometimes referred as game engagement. And in this situation, it then covers immersion, flow, and presence. So from this perspective, the game engagement is the general engagement that incorporates different aspects of the game. It also incorporates involvement, which is a term that is sometimes replaced by absorption also in the literature. They both refer to the cognitive and emotional involvement the player can have with the game. And it has been shown that involvement is linked to novelty in games, which can influence engagement. So these are all interconnected together. You also have curiosity and preferences that are at play here. So basically, the players will be more or less engaged depending on their games and genre preferences. So is it a game they like or not? That would play a big role. And also depending on the curiosity aspect. So do they like to try new things or not? Or do they just like to stick to their preferences? And lastly, challenge also has a significant impact on the engagement level. So more challenge generally result in more engagement from the player. So we then have immersion. So immersion represents the degree of involvement with the game. I talked about absorption and involvement just before, and just to specify something, immersion is not exactly the same concept, so they share many similarities, but like the similarities would be the feeling of control, attention, enjoyment, temporal dissociation. But immersion is an active experience you get when you play the game, whereas absorption is more of an attitude that the player has towards the game. With immersion, then you have this emotional investment with the game. You can see that also in the example of the question used that was created by Jeanette and her colleagues. So the questions are more oriented towards empathy, aesthetic, suspense, emotional attachment, these kind of things. And then you have another question also with other example, which is from the game experience questionnaire. So questions are like, it was aesthetically pleasing, I was interested in the game story, I felt imaginative. So you can see that the focus of the questions are different from the one used for engagement. So here we have a study actually about immersion and perceived appeal of the game. And the author suggests that based on this level of appeal that the player creates or perceive it, the player then decide to get himself or herself immersed into the game. It then means that the visual of the game is very important because it sort of creates the first impression that the player has of the game. And based on that, they would then decide to move on or not. But of course, the game itself also has to be immersive to keep the players immersed for a longer period of time. And this effect was both present in inexperienced and experienced players. But that doesn't mean that the two groups had the same experience, as you can see also on the graph. So they have different results. So as you can see in this study, they used two different games. So they used Half-Life and World of Warcraft for the study. You can see on the graph on the left with immersion that the level is way bigger with Warcraft than it is with Half-Life. And in this study, they used the questionnaire created by Janet, so the one I just showed you before. And then we also see that there is a main effect of the game played on appeal. So on the graph in the middle, you can see that Warcraft was perceived as way more appealing than Half-Life, which kind of makes sense because it was the first Half-Life also that was released earlier. And so Warcraft kind of had better graphics back then and at least had more diverse environment than Half-Life. So that's something we can also assume. Just something important to mention here is that they talk about experienced and inexperienced players, and basically they were all video game players, but the difference how they do it is inexperienced would be someone who had never played either Half-Life or Warcraft, but they were generally playing games. So for Appeal, the most recent and nice looking game is perceived as more appealing by the inexperienced than the experienced players. So that would be the blue line in the graph in the middle. But for Half-Life, the perceived appeal increased over time, as you can see on the graph in the middle with the green light. So you can see that they go in a different way. So it increased with Half-Life and it decreased with Warcraft. And so why does it increase with one and decrease with the other one? So the author suggests that it is because Warcraft tries to attract more new players, whereas Half-Life tries to provide a consistent experience which meet the player's expectation, which might be partially true, but there is kind of more to it too. But so for this part, it's true that generally with games that require a long-term engagement and retention, it might be better to immediately offer the best looking part to the players. So sort of like to make them stay in the game, to make them want to play more. Also because it has been shown that the beauty and the hedonic qualities of a product generally have a greater impact on the general experience at the beginning of it. So it's something important to include at the beginning of a game. But I think it could also be due to boredom, which might occur over time with games that require a lot of gameplay and hours spent. But so the experienced players still find the game appealing, but not as much as someone who plays it for the first time. And to really see the changes, if the changes happen over time and not just because of differences amongst the players, you should probably use a longitudinal approach in which you would then ask some people how appealing they find the game at the beginning of their experience or the first time they play it, and then later on in the experience with the game. So in this scenario, that would be the same players just saying how they perceive the game at different times. So nevertheless, there's something interesting to remember when you want your game to be immersive. If you play test, for example, with new players all the time, they might perceive the game as very appealing and therefore be more immersed. But this feeling might diminish over time if they end up playing it a lot. But with this study, there is also some limitation and flaws. So since it is comparing two different games, all the other factors other than appeal of the game are not controlled, which means that the appeal and immersion levels could also be explained by another factor that is not measured and not mentioned here. Something else to mention is the demographics of the participants. So basically some were playing RPG games and others were playing FPS games. And then they got assigned to the other game they had never played. The issue is that it has been shown that RPG players have a higher need for immersion than FPS players, who instead have a higher need for achievement. And finally, World of Warcraft is a multiplayer game which adds this cooperative dimension that can also influence the immersion. And so the presence of other players are more likely to make you feel more engaged and immersed in the game. Here we have another study that basically separates immersion in three different kinds. So you can, for example, see civilization in the right of the graph, and it has a very high level of challenge-based immersion, but a very low level of the two other kinds. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it, because the imaginative aspect is not really present in this game, since it is more or less real. And for the sensory immersion, you don't get specifically immersed with sounds or images like the focus is more or less far with the camera, for example. Now, if you check Half-Life, which is on the left side, you see that it is very high on the sensory immersion. So the fact that it is a FPS is most likely going to help with that, because you feel more like the character in the game, hearing and seeing the things around you when you move around. Something else that is worth remembering, though, is that the three types of immersions are not equal. And so, for example, the sensory immersion doesn't have as much impact as the imaginative immersion on the general immersion level of the player. And as you can see, we also have then the Half-Life game that was tested here, and World of Warcraft again. But here you can see that Half-Life 2 scores highest on almost all the dimension. So that could mean that Half-Life 2 had better graphics than the first one, and therefore players perceived appeal to be higher and they were more immersed. But it could also be related to the method they use. So in the first study, they asked people to play the game first and then to answer a questionnaire. Whereas here, the people had already played the game beforehand, and we don't really know how much experience they had with it. So it is surely something to remember and to consider when you test the game also. Now a little bit about flow. So flow is described by 8 major characteristics, such as clear goals, control, feedback, or balance between challenge and skills. This concept is not specific to games, but it is used in many different disciplines also. In games, it is sometimes referred as game flow as well. So flow is supposed to be the result of a balance between challenge and skills, and it should provide the most enjoyable and immersive experience to the players. Some studies show that the highest level of flow was achieved for moderate and high level players when the challenge was matching their skills. But for the unskilled players, the challenge level didn't have any effect on the flow level. So at low, moderate, and high challenge level, they basically always had the same flow experience, which seemed to indicate that indeed flow requires both challenge and skills and not just one. But the balance between the two is shouldn't always be optimal. Another study also found out that a dynamic pacing resulted in a greater flow than constant balance between challenge and skills. So basically what it means is that when you have a balance and it sometimes decreases and sometimes goes back to the balance, this situation would result in more flow experience than a constant balance all the time. So basically it shouldn't be always optimal in a way. Flow is closely related to immersion too, but one major difference is that flow is mostly used to describe an optimal experience, whereas immersion can reach different levels and is therefore sort of less intense than flow. So you can, for example, be immersed and still aware of your surroundings somehow, but with flow, as it is described in the theory, you should not be able to focus on something else than the game itself. And as you can see from the questionnaires item on the slide also, the question is still kind of different from immersion. So you have, for flow, you have I lost track of time, or I was deeply concentrated in the game. And for immersion, you have, I found it impressive and I was interested in the game story. So there is still a nuance here. Immersion refer more to the narrative and the visual experience, the sort of wow experience and feeling the player can get from the game. Whereas flow doesn't have this visual or narrative aspect. It is focused on the game more generally, so it can pretty much be anything, but it often also integrates more the mechanics of the game. But obviously, if now you are interested in the game story, you are most likely going to be concentrated in the game as well. But for instance, if now, let's say you are very concentrated in Angry Birds and you want to play it and you find it challenging and rewarding, you might still not experience a lot of immersion because not all the dimensions are present to offer this kind of experience to the player. Now we have presence. So present refer more to the fact of being in the game, like being somewhere else than the actual world or environment. It is more defined as a state of mind, so how you perceive yourself, how you feel. And if we look at the different things that can influence it, you can see that it is still pretty close to immersion too, with concepts like control, attention, atmosphere, concentration, these kind of things. There's still some nuance between the two though. So presence is a feeling of being somewhere else, and immersion is the actual experience of being sort of separated or secluded from the real world. So these two are still a bit different. So you could, for example, feel present in a simulated world game, like world simulation, but not be very immersed if there isn't much to stimulate you in this environment. It is also connected to...
Raphael, just real quick, you've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay. It is also connected to flow, as you can imagine, since it also requires concentration, feedback, and control. And it is more precisely a good predictor of flow. In research, it is mostly studied in virtual reality games, as these games integrate more the vividness aspect of the games. So we have 3 different kinds of presence. So spatial presence, which refers to being in the environment. There is the physical presence, which refers to using, for example, your hands or your body, using tools, these kind of things. So therefore, this level is usually high in virtual reality or using remote control. And a third kind is self-presence, which refers to a more emotional presence than the 2 others. It is when you actually feel that your virtual self is the real self. So you also have self-representation, so it is related to self-presence. And for example, enjoyment was greater when self-discrepancy was reduced. So that means when the virtual character was acting accordingly to what the player would have done. You have 2 kinds of self-representation. So the para-authentic, which is the actual representation of self, and the artificial representation, which is the artificially created representation of self then. And yeah, presence has been linked also to other personality traits, for instance, immersive tendencies, absorption, and self-transcendence. So someone who would score high on these dimensions would most likely show a greater level of presence. So now motivation. So I approach motivation here from the self-determination theory, which is that the 3 human needs are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Then you have 3 kinds of motivation: the intrinsic, the extrinsic, so you do things for external reward, like food or money, and the experimental motivation, which is a mix between intrinsic and social motivation. But so these 3 needs are supposed to intrinsically motivate the players, and the more intrinsic the motivation is, the more enjoyment the player get from playing the game. Motivation is also a good predictor of flow, immersion, and presence, which are all kind of connected together. The control of choice in a game is going to increase the intrinsic reward the player gets from it. So it is something we see, for example, in games where you have different approach to beat the game. The player feel a sense of control and autonomy that leads to a greater feeling of achievement and pride. Something interesting is that players of different genres have different needs. So FPS players have a greater need for achievement, whereas RPG players have a greater need for immersion. So it is important to know also what kind of games your players play and what they prefer. And another factor is that men are also more motivated by achievement than women, and they experience generally more stimulation from the game. And so you can see also in the right corner an example of a questionnaire they would use for motivation. So I'm briefly going to talk about usability. So usability refers to effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction while performing a task. But often these three components are not enough for describing the whole experience in a game. So playability is often preferred because it offers a better understanding of the concept. And it integrates the same component on usability, but add or on top of it, basically. So satisfaction depends on motivation, emotion, and socialization as well. So we have, for example, the pragmatic aspect of the game that have been shown to correlate with the perceived appeal of the game. So if a game is easy to use and the mechanics are efficient, so the players would perceive it as more appealing. But it also works the other way around. So if the game is perceived as very appealing, then the usability is perceived as being higher too. We also have motivation, which can influence appeal and immersion, and therefore they have to be considered when you screen for the players basically and want to test the game. And the experience with the game also is important to consider, since experienced players usually perceive the game as more usable than the non-experienced players, and players with less experience perceive stimulation to be higher. So the first time you play, you're going to be more stimulated than the first time. So just some key points to conclude. So first, consider more the motivation of the players. So autonomy and competence and relatedness are important to consider. And if you want to check more about these, there are two very good GDC talks from Nikki and Scott Rigby. Pay attention to the players you recruit, so be aware of the effect of age, gender, preferences, experience. All these things can have an impact on it. Match player skills. So for example, in Resident Evil 4, you had to select the difficulty, but during the game, if you would, for example, miss all your shots and die a lot, the difficulty would adjust and then therefore provide a better experience for the players basically, because it would match their skills. You should also remove undesired frustration. So Journey is an example of game that integrate desired frustration in the sense that it creates a sense of unknown, discovery, and therefore creates a sense of mastery when you manage to find your way, these kind of things. It's also something you find in, for example, Dark Souls, where you have this huge feeling of competency and autonomy when you finally beat a boss, for example. And last, you should pay attention to usability issues, as it can have an impact on the rest of the experience, so the appeal, the immersion, and flow. Here you have just a few articles I used for the thesis, but I will send the whole paper I wrote in the Discord group and maybe somewhere else, so everyone can have access to it and access to all the articles too. So that's it. Thank you very much for all your attention. Feel free to send a question in the Q&A or to any contact you have here. And yeah, I would be happy to answer whatever question you have. So that's it for me. I guess you can prepare everything for the next host. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really great. Good. I don't know if you can see the chat, but you were getting a lot of appreciative messages here. I don't think we have time for other questions right now because we are up at the time for our next presenter. We want to make sure we get started, but I appreciate you sharing your contact information. So hopefully anybody that has questions afterwards or a couple in the chat, people can reach out to you afterwards.
Yeah, you can prepare the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.